Hi guys, so there was an interesting exchange that took place between Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer on the issue of border closure. Now, Priti Patel had advised the government to close the border. Boris Johnson overruled the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, and did not close the border. So let's hear the exchange that took place.
Last night, the Home Secretary told a Conservative Party event that, and these were her words, on should we have closed our borders earlier, the answer is yes. I was an advocate, says the Home Secretary, of closing them last March. Why did the Prime Minister overrule the Home Secretary?
Now, listen to the question. Why did the Prime Minister overrule the Home Secretary? So she had said, we should close the borders. It would be a good idea. If we had closed the borders, we wouldn't have had all these problems. Keir Starmer is pointing out that, and this is interesting, he's pointing out that his Home Secretary is fighting with him. This is not Sage, this is not the opposition, this is within his own government, within his own cabinet. His Home Secretary is saying we should have closed the borders, and Boris Johnson said no. So he's pointing out this inconsistency, which is not just an inconsistency regarding something trivial. This is extremely important because if the borders had been closed, it could have affected the spread of the pandemic.
Mr. Speaker, I think it was last March that the Right Honourable Gentleman, along with many others, was actually saying that we didn't need to close borders, but as...
So once again, Boris doesn't listen to the question, starts talking about something else, and attacks the opposition. The question was not about whether it was a good idea to open or close the borders. It was the Home Secretary had said we should close the borders, and she's responsible for the borders, and you overruled her. Why did you do that?
As usual, Captain Hindsight has changed his tune to suit events. We are facing, and it's interesting that his first few questions were about a computer glitch in the Home Office, Mr. Speaker, which we're trying to rectify. We're in the middle of a national pandemic.
Once again, he shifts the blame onto something else. Stop talking about the inconsistency in our policy to deal with the pandemic. And remember, there's a pandemic. Your incompetence has cost lives, Boris Johnson. If you had closed the borders at the beginning, and now once again he's going to talk about the European Union in a sort of thinly veiled way. The European Union, in Schengen, the countries that are part of Schengen closed their borders. It wasn't necessary to leave the European Union to close the borders. You were fully capable of doing that. In the UK, it was the same. Fully capable to close the border. Many people were asking, why are the borders still open? Why are airports still open? Why is it possible that people can fly into the UK in the middle of a pandemic? The problem is, on the one side, you have maybe Priti Patel, who's maybe demonstrating some sort of leadership, courage, understanding, saying, we have a pandemic, we should close the border. On the other hand, you have Boris Johnson, who's like, oh, we don't want to piss off businesses. We want to we don't want to appear that there's a pandemic on the rampage. This is back last year. At the same time as Boris Johnson was saying we need to take it on the chin, and him saying that he was going around shaking hands with people in hospital. Shortly after, the Home Secretary said we should have closed the borders, and Boris Johnson overruled her. This is the main point here. Ignore whatever Boris Johnson is talking about, Captain Hindsight or any of this other crap. The main issue here is that the Home Secretary said we need to close the border, and Boris Johnson said no. Why?
And this country is facing a very, very grave death toll. And we are doing everything we can to protect the British public, which is, I think, what he would expect. And that's why we've instituted one of the toughest border regimes in the world.
We've instituted now. The question was back in March. Why did you overrule the Home Secretary back in March?
That's why we insist that you have to get a test 72 hours before you fly. There must be a pass.
It's a bit like if somebody said, why did your house was on fire last year? Why didn't you call the fire brigade? And you say, well, I'm calling the fire brigade now. But not now. You should have done it last year. Yeah, but I'm doing it now. See what I'm doing? Look, I'm on the phone now calling the fire brigade. Yes, but the house is already burnt down. What's the point in calling the fire brigade at this stage? And instead of responding to the person who's asking you, why are you calling the fire brigade now? You say, look at me. I'm calling the fire brigade. What do you want? What do you want me to do? No, I want you to call the fire brigade last year. I wanted you to close the border last year. It's irrelevant whether Keir Starmer was asking for the border to be closed. The Home Secretary was suggesting it should be closed. She should know something about the borders. It's her responsibility to control the borders.
Passenger locator form, which you have to provide, Mr. Speaker, and then you must quarantine for 10 days or 5 days if you do a second.
Just this is pointless rhetoric. It's useless information. Who gives a crap about that? We're concerned about why the Home Secretary was suggesting something should be done, and you said no. Why?
A second test, and it's all very, I'm delighted that he now praises the Home Secretary. In fact, a change of tune from the right honourable gentleman, and I'm delighted that he's now in favour of tough border controls, because he wasn't last year, Mr. Speaker, and indeed he campaigned for the leadership of the Labour Party on a manifesto to get back to free movement, Mr. Speaker.
Once again, the attack. Well, let's bring Brexit into this discussion. The discussion is about you and your Home Secretary, and Boris Johnson has talked about documentation now, checks now, and attacks on Keir Starmer for supporting freedom of movement, which has got nothing to do with this. Absolutely nothing. As I said before, countries that are in Schengen were able to close the borders. There was exemptions. So we're in the middle of a pandemic. We need to close the border. Okay. The European Union said. The UK was never a member of Schengen. So even when it was a member, it could have done it. Now, and I'm getting confused here because Boris Johnson is confusing.
Mr. Speaker, he talks of hindsight. What the Home Secretary said last night, Prime Minister, it's not disputed, is that she was saying last March, this is not hindsight, she, the Home Secretary, was saying to the Prime Minister, you need to shut your borders. She was saying it. So I repeat the question the Prime Minister avoided. Why did he overrule the Home Secretary who claims that she said last March that we should shut our borders?
Mr. Speaker, we've instituted one of the toughest border regimes.
Once again, he doesn't answer the question. He's incapable of answering a question. Why did you overrule her? He could easily say, because I thought she was wrong. But then that would open another can of worms. If he says it was a mistake, she was right, then that would open another can of worms. So it's all about defending himself. If he said, well, she was wrong, then he's not defending the Home Secretary. And then obviously the next question would be, then if you don't trust your Home Secretary, why is she there? If he says, I was wrong, then the next question would be, why are you there? Do you understand? This is why Boris Johnson doesn't answer questions. Because he messes up. He makes an absolute disaster. And instead of actually saying, yes, I was wrong, because if he said I was wrong, I think it would be an honourable thing to say. If you're wrong about something, own up to it, own it, say, my mea culpa, I made this mistake. I'll try to make amends. You don't have to resign over some of these. I think he should, but it's not necessary for him to resign. How many people have died at this stage? Isn't that enough to resign over? But it's not for Boris Johnson. He knows he has messed up. He knows he's incapable of defending his record. But instead of defending it, he redirects the conversation in another direction.
in the world. And it was only last March that he, along with many others in his party, were continuing to support an open border approach. And I must say that
An open border... I don't know if that's the case. But this is irrelevant. Keir Starmer is not in power. Jeremy Corbyn was not in power. The Labour Party were not in power. Whether they said, yes, there should be an open border, is irrelevant. They were not the government. You are the government. You can't say, well, you know, if they were for an open border, then they have no right to complain. I don't think that was the case, but it's irrelevant because they're not the government. You are the government. Let's get back to the main point here. The Home Secretary said there should be a border closed. You said no. Why?
the whole experience of listening to the right honourable gentleman over the last few months has really been like listening to a weather vane, watching a weather vane spin round and round depending on where the breezes are blowing.
And look at the nodding dogs behind. Yes, yes, well done, Boris. Yes, you're saying the right thing. Is anyone convinced by this? I'd like to know. Is this convincing to anyone? Boris Johnson was asked a question about his Home Secretary, and he starts talking about weather vanes, and he starts talking about freedom of movement in the European Union, and he starts talking about Captain Hindsight. How is any of that relevant to the question? Like, you don't have to be a Remainer, you don't have to be anti-Boris Johnson, but please tell me, how is it possible a question about what the Prime Minister did following advice by the Home Secretary got to do with any of that? What's wrong with answering the question? You don't have to, even the most hardline Boris supporter, why can't he answer the question? Please tell me, why did he not answer the question? You could say, why should he bother answering the question? It's just Keir Starmer. No, because Keir Starmer is there to do a job. His job is to hold the government to account. If Boris Johnson can't answer the question, he should just say, I'm sorry, I can't answer the question, and sit down. What's the point in just blah, blah, blah? What's the point in all of this bluster? Political theatre. It's a waste of people's time. What is the point in having a parliament if the Prime Minister doesn't answer questions? Why is he even there? Why doesn't he just sit at home, scratching his arse? It'd be actually more productive. You might get something done, because this isn't getting anything done. This is a complete and utter waste of time. And a waste of money, because Boris Johnson is on at least £150,000 a year. To do what? To not answer questions. Would put me there, give me £150,000 a year, and I won't answer questions either. I'd actually try and answer questions, unlike Boris Johnson. So once again, Prime Minister's questions, a complete and utter waste of time, because Boris Johnson is a complete and utter waste of space. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons. You ensure that this channel continues to exist. I'm eternally grateful for all of your support. If you join Patreon, you will receive instant access to our Discord server, where we have both audio and video chats. You can chat with me and other patrons, where we discuss important and non-important issues. Becoming a patron per month costs about the same as a large coffee, so why not check it out?